Hi everyone, and welcome to this short video on how to craft a personal narrative. Actually, what we're going to explore here can apply to any narrative at all. It can be an alternative way of looking at a news story, or an advert structure, or an overall brand story. I've introduced it this week because I think a personal narrative from a customer who has benefited from a product or service, or a community member who has benefited from the work of a charity, can be really effective in convincing a reader of a direct mail to do what you want them to do. Do think laterally if you decide to do one of the other creative and persuasive genres for your assignment though, and consider how you could apply this to an anecdote in a speech or to certain types of radio ad. So, what makes a good story? To find out, we're going to learn from a couple of theorists who thought about narrative. Narrative simply means the way words are used to present a set of connected events as an overall story. At its very basis, a story needs a recognizable beginning, middle, and end. Tzvetan Todorov saw this as a bit more than just dividing a story into three sections. For him, narrative was something dynamic that included changes in the state of affairs in the world. In Todorov's model, the beginning equates to equilibrium, the middle is disequilibrium, and the end sees a restoration of equilibrium. So what are equilibrium and disequilibrium then? Have you ever tried to use a balance board? You could think of disequilibrium as the state when you're a bit all over the place and trying to balance the board, but you haven't quite managed it. Equilibrium is the state when you have managed to completely balance the board. Or you could think of it in relation to a boat or plane journey that encounters turbulence or rough seas. It doesn't have to be as literal as that though. Think about your own experience of finding work or uni challenging and then cracking it, or where a friendship or relationship is tricky and then you work it out. These are metaphorical cases of disequilibrium and equilibrium, and they are all the basis for stories. Another interesting person in relation to narrative is William Labov. He broke the thing down a bit further and talked about narrative categories. He claimed that all or the vast majority of narratives contained each of these categories. It can be useful to think of them as a set of questions. Here they are. Do you notice how Todorov's concepts can map onto Labov's categories? The abstract and orientation are the initial equilibrium, aren't they? Then the complicating action is the disequilibrium, and the resolution is the restoration of equilibrium. This is an important reminder that concepts within a subject area are usually not completely different and discrete from one another. There is often a link, and they often build on one another. These theoretical concepts are always easier to understand if we apply them to an example. So, I've made up a random scenario for you and built a narrative around it. Pause the video here and make sure you've taken a note of both Todorov's and Labov's concepts. You could just go back and take a screenshot of the relevant bit of the video. Then pause the video on this story, read through it, and see if you can have a stab at identifying where each of the concepts fit on the story. So, how did you get on? Let me illustrate it for you visually. Let's think about Todorov's concepts first. Here's the equilibrium, the disequilibrium, and the restoration of equilibrium. Now, let's think about Labov's narrative categories. Here's how I see them fitting onto our story. Hopefully Eamon and Mickey's romance helped you understand narrative. Let's hope their future relationship sticks with the equilibrium and doesn't come across too much disequilibrium. Just before we go, there are a couple of key points to note. Firstly, evaluation often doesn't just happen once in a discrete extract of a narrative. It happens twice in our story. In some narratives, it will happen all the way through, and sometimes concurrently with other categories. It can depend on what the function of the narrative is. If you think about it, evaluation is probably more likely to happen more frequently in persuasive genres, where you're trying to get your audience to evaluate things positively in the same way as you do. So bear that in mind as you develop your writing in these more persuasive and creative genres. Secondly, Lebov's narrative categories don't always have to go in order. Sometimes, particularly in more creative genres like film and literature, you will be presented with events out of chronological sequence to build suspense or to make it more interesting. There might never be a coda to work out what it all means, or even a resolution. You can make a certain amount of use of that creative type of narrative in your written communication depending on the genre, but for our purposes of putting a little bite-sized story in a direct mail, an anecdote in a speech, or a story in 30 seconds for a radio ad, it's best to keep it simple. I hope you've enjoyed exploring narrative with me, and with Todorov and Lebov, and with Eamon and Mickey, in this short video. I'm sure if you play around with it a bit, you will find that you can bring real richness to your written communication with narrative. Happy writing!